Have you ever noticed that the people who demand the most explanations are often the least interested in understanding you? At first, that sounds backwards. We grow up believing that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, patiently enough, or lovingly enough, misunderstandings will disappear. But real life tells a different story. Think about someone who constantly asks, "Why did you do that?" Or "What do you mean?" At first, it feels like they're trying to understand you, so you explain. Then you explain again. And somehow, every answer creates another question. Before long, you're no longer having a conversation. You're defending your personality, your intentions, and even your emotions. Here's what most people completely miss. Healthy relationships seek clarity. Unhealthy relationships often seek control disguised as clarity. This isn't just about romantic relationships. It happens with family members, close friends, coworkers, and even people you've only recently met. The pattern always looks similar. One person keeps explaining. The other person keeps moving the goalposts. Why? Because constant explaining isn't always solving confusion. Sometimes it's feeding a psychological dynamic where one person unconsciously becomes the judge while the other becomes the defendant. But here's where it gets interesting. Everything changes the moment an empath stops participating in that cycle. Not because they become cold, not because they stop caring, but because they finally recognize the difference between being understood and endlessly trying to earn permission to exist. Almost nobody realizes how powerful that shift really is. By the end of this video, you'll understand why empaths often spend years over-explaining themselves, why certain personalities become uncomfortable when that suddenly stops, and how this single behavioral change quietly transforms confidence, communication, attraction, and every relationship around them. Today's topic is: what happens when an empath finally stops explaining themselves? The moment an empath stops explaining themselves, many people become surprisingly uncomfortable. At first glance, that reaction doesn't make sense. If endless explanations were exhausting for everyone involved, shouldn't silence make the relationship healthier? Sometimes it does, but sometimes it exposes a psychological pattern that had been hidden all along. Here's where it gets interesting. Many relationships quietly develop invisible roles. One person becomes the emotional caretaker, while the other becomes the evaluator. The empath unconsciously takes responsibility for everyone's comfort, constantly checking whether they have upset someone, disappointed someone, or failed to meet an unspoken expectation. In response, the other person gradually grows accustomed to receiving reassurance without ever realizing they've come to expect it. When the empath suddenly says, "That's simply my decision," and leaves it there, the entire emotional balance shifts. The other person is no longer being fed the constant stream of explanations they had unconsciously relied on. That absence often creates uncertainty. Have you ever noticed how some people become more persistent the moment you become calmer? They ask the same question in three different ways. They revisit old conversations. They search your facial expressions for hidden meanings. It isn't always because they're manipulative. Sometimes it's because predictable patterns have changed, and the human brain naturally tries to restore what feels familiar. Psychologists call this an expectation violation. Our brains are constantly predicting how other people will behave. When someone suddenly behaves differently, especially in a confident and emotionally regulated way, it interrupts those predictions. The mind immediately begins searching for an explanation. That's why people often assume something must be wrong, when in reality, something has finally become healthy. Imagine a close friend who usually spends 20 minutes explaining why they can't attend a gathering. One day they simply smile and say, "I won't make it this time. I hope you all have a great evening." No guilt, no elaborate story, no apology for having boundaries. The people who genuinely respect them accept the answer and move on. But someone who depended on those lengthy justifications may feel strangely unsettled, asking, "Are you upset with us?" Or "Did we do something wrong?" The change isn't in the words, it's in the confidence behind them. Body language plays a powerful role here. An empath who has stopped over explaining often speaks more slowly, maintains steady eye contact, pauses comfortably, and resists the urge to fill silence with extra details. Those subtle signals communicate emotional security. Ironically, saying less often makes people listen more carefully because every word carries greater weight. This changes everything because communication is no longer driven by fear of being misunderstood. It's driven by self-respect. And once that shift happens, another fascinating pattern begins to emerge. People start revealing whether they were interested in understanding you or simply accustomed to having access to your constant emotional reassurance. That distinction becomes impossible to ignore, and it leads directly into the next psychological principle. Once an empath stops explaining themselves, people begin to reveal who they really are. This is one of the quietest yet most powerful psychological shifts in any relationship. The empath hasn't changed their values or stopped caring. They've simply removed the habit of over-justifying every feeling, every boundary, and every decision. Without realizing it, they've taken away a filter that used to hide other people's true intentions. Have you ever noticed that some people respect your first no, while others treat it as the beginning of a negotiation? That difference tells you more about them than it does about you. Here's what most people completely miss. A healthy person listens to your words. An unhealthy person often searches for loopholes. If you explain your boundary in great detail, someone who doesn't respect it may focus on the explanation instead of the boundary itself. They begin debating your reasons instead of accepting your decision. Suddenly, you're discussing whether your reasons are good enough rather than whether your choice deserves respect. This is a common psychological blind spot. We assume people are arguing because they don't understand us. In reality, they may understand perfectly. They simply don't like the outcome. More explanations won't solve that problem because the disagreement isn't about clarity. It's about control, expectations, or unmet desires. Imagine an empath who decides not to lend money to a relative. In the past, they would explain their financial situation, apologize repeatedly, and promise to help another time. The conversation would last an hour and leave everyone emotionally drained. This time, they calmly say, "I'm not able to do that." Nothing more. The relative immediately starts asking questions. Why not? Is it because of me? You helped someone else before. What's changed? Notice what's happening. The original boundary is no longer the focus. The conversation is being pulled toward making the empath defend their decision. But the empath doesn't take the bait. They simply repeat with kindness and consistency, "I'm not able to do that." That calm repetition does something remarkable. It forces the other person to decide whether they can respect a boundary without being given unlimited access to the reasoning behind it. Their response becomes a reflection of their emotional maturity. Confidence isn't measured by how persuasive you are. It's measured by how peaceful you remain when someone disagrees with you. An empath who understands this no longer feels responsible for managing every emotional reaction around them. They recognize that empathy doesn't mean sacrificing self-respect. And this is where attraction, trust, and influence begin to change in unexpected ways. Because when people realize they can no longer pull endless explanations out of you, they start interacting with you differently. Some relationships become stronger. Others begin to fall apart. The psychology behind that transformation is exactly what we'll explore next. This is the point where many empaths experience something they never expected. As they stop explaining themselves, they often become more respected and, in many cases, more attractive. Not because they've become mysterious or emotionally distant, but because they've begun communicating from a place of inner certainty instead of external approval. Human beings are naturally drawn to emotional stability. When someone appears comfortable with their own decisions, it signals confidence, self awareness, and psychological security. These qualities create trust because they suggest the person isn't constantly changing to satisfy whoever happens to be standing in front of them. Have you ever noticed that the calmest person in the room often says the least? They don't rush to fill every silence. They don't panic when someone disagrees with them. They don't feel compelled to win every argument. That quiet confidence changes the emotional atmosphere without demanding attention. Here's what most people completely miss. Confidence isn't loud. It's consistent. When an empath constantly explains themselves, their communication unintentionally sends the message, I hope you'll approve of this decision. But when they calmly state their position and remain emotionally steady, the message becomes, I've thought this through, and I'm at peace with it. That subtle shift transforms how others perceive them. Imagine a couple discussing weekend plans. In the past, the empath would spend 10 minutes explaining why they needed a day alone to recharge. They would apologize repeatedly, promise to make it up later, and worry that their partner might feel rejected. Now they simply say, I'd like some quiet time this Saturday. I'll be much more present afterward. A secure partner hears that as healthy communication. They recognize that personal space isn't emotional distance, it's emotional maintenance. An insecure partner, however, may interpret the same boundary as rejection because they depended on constant reassurance rather than mutual trust. This is where emotional intelligence becomes essential. An empath who stops over explaining also becomes better at observing instead of reacting. Rather than immediately trying to fix another person's discomfort, they become curious about it. They ask themselves, is this emotion to solve? Or is it theirs to process? That single question creates an enormous psychological shift. Baby language reinforces this transformation. Their shoulders stay relaxed. Their breathing slows. They maintain comfortable eye contact without becoming defensive. They no longer rush to fill pauses with nervous words. Ironically, silence begins working in their favor. People often assign greater credibility to someone who speaks with calm intention rather than constant justification. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Not everyone responds positively to this healthier version of the empath. Some people become more respectful, others become frustrated, even angry. Why? Because the empath has unknowingly removed a source of emotional access they once took for granted. And understanding that reaction reveals one of the most important lessons about relationship dynamics, which we'll explore in the next keynote. One of the hardest truths an empath eventually discovers is that not every relationship was built on mutual understanding. Some relationships were built on unlimited emotional access. As long as the empath kept explaining, reassuring, apologizing, and proving their intentions, the relationship felt stable. But once those behaviors disappeared, the foundation was tested. This doesn't mean the other person is automatically toxic. Human beings become comfortable with familiar patterns. If someone has always received endless explanations from you, they may unconsciously believe they're entitled to them. When that pattern changes, they often experience uncertainty before they experience understanding. Have you ever noticed how some people become more demanding after you've become healthier? They ask, why are you acting different? You've changed. You used to tell me everything. Those statements may sound caring on the surface, but listen carefully. Sometimes they're expressing genuine concern. Other times, they're expressing discomfort because the relationship no longer works the way it used to. Here's what most people completely miss. Growth often feels like rejection to someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Imagine an empath who always answered every late-night phone call from a friend. No matter how exhausted they were, they listened for hours because they didn't want to seem uncaring. Eventually, they realized they were neglecting their own well-being. They decided to answer only when they genuinely had the emotional energy. The friend's reaction revealed everything. A healthy friend might say, "I understand. Let me know when you're free." Someone who had become dependent on unrestricted access might respond, "I guess you don't care anymore." Notice the difference. One response respects the boundary, the other tries to create guilt. This is where self-awareness becomes your greatest protection. Emotional intelligence isn't just recognizing another person's feelings. It's recognizing when those feelings are being handed to you as your responsibility. Empaths often carry emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. They confuse compassion with obligation, believing they must fix every disappointment around them. But true compassion includes yourself. The healthiest relationships don't require one person to constantly earn acceptance. They allow both people to express needs, set boundaries, and disagree without fear of losing respect. Trust grows because honesty is welcomed, not because explanations are endless. This changes everything because the empath begins filtering relationships differently. Instead of asking, "How can I make this person understand me?" they start asking, "Is this someone who genuinely wants to understand me?" That question saves years of emotional exhaustion. And once an empath reaches that point, they experience the greatest transformation of all. Not in how others see them, but in how they finally see themselves. That's the powerful lesson we'll bring together in our final keynote and conclusion. The greatest transformation doesn't happen the day an empath stops explaining themselves. It happens the day they stop believing that their worth depends on being understood by everyone. That realization is surprisingly freeing. For years, many empaths measure the health of a relationship by one question: did I explain myself well enough? But emotionally mature people ask a very different question: did I communicate honestly and respectfully? Those are not the same thing. You can communicate with complete honesty, calmness, and respect, and another person may still choose to misunderstand you. That isn't always a communication problem. Sometimes it's a reflection of their expectations, their emotional state, their attachment style, or their unwillingness to accept an answer they don't like. Have you ever noticed how peaceful life becomes when you stop chasing universal approval? You don't become less compassionate. In fact, you often become more compassionate because your kindness is no longer driven by fear. It's driven by genuine choice. Imagine an empath who once spent hours replaying conversations in their mind, wondering if they should have used different words, offered more reassurance, or explained one more detail. Now, after expressing themselves clearly, they allow the conversation to end. They don't obsess over every reaction. They don't rewrite the past in their head. That mental energy is redirected toward people who communicate with mutual respect. Here's what almost nobody realizes. This quiet confidence influences others more than endless persuasion ever could. People begin trusting your words because they're consistent. Your boundaries become easier to respect because they aren't wrapped in guilt or uncertainty. Your relationships become more authentic because they are based on honesty rather than emotional negotiation. This doesn't mean every relationship survives, some won't. But the ones that do are often stronger than ever because both people learn to communicate without one person carrying all the emotional responsibility. Self-awareness is the foundation of emotional intelligence. The more clearly you understand your own patterns, the less likely you are to repeat them unconsciously. An empath who no longer over-explains isn't becoming distant. They're becoming emotionally balanced. They're recognizing that empathy is most powerful when it's paired with healthy boundaries, self-respect, and the courage to let their words stand on their own. And that's the real turning point. Not when everyone finally understands you, but when you no longer need everyone to. From that moment forward, your relationships stop revolving around proving who you are and start reflecting who you've become.